Hi, how are you doing? This is the follow-up to the video that dropped a few days ago on natural moral law. And what I'm going to do in this one is I'm going to take you through a little bit of the later stuff. So we've done the basics of natural moral law. Hopefully that's sort of fairly clear for you. But there's a few developments that came out of natural moral law that are worth looking at, some of which you can get questions on, other aspects of which it's just useful to know, particularly if you're trying to evaluate natural moral law as a whole. So we're going to talk about proportionalism. We're also going to talk about double effect a little bit, and we're going to look at how natural moral law evolved after the time of Aquinas. So let's start with double effect. So the principle of double effect didn't directly come from Aquinas, I don't think. This was a slightly later development. And the intention behind it was to help people in situations where there were going to be two outcomes. So that's why it's called double effect. So sometimes you do something and something good happens and something bad happens. It's to help you navigate those particular situations. So it goes something like this. It's permitted to do a good action with an unintended bad consequence, but you cannot perform a bad action to achieve a good consequence. So let's break that down a little bit. So you're allowed to do anything that natural moral law considers a good action, and you figure that out using your primary and secondary precepts. If that is your intention to do that action, then it's okay if it has an unintended bad consequence, even if that consequence was foreseeable. But what you can't do is do a bad action, so something that would not be allowed by the primary and secondary precepts, in order to achieve a good consequence. So we've got an example here that relates to killing in self-defense. So let's say somebody attacks you. Natural moral law would say that you have a right to defend yourself to a reasonable extent. And we get that from the primary precept to preserve innocent life. You count as an innocent life. You are being attacked. You have the right to do what you need to do to defend your life. So if that's your intention, to defend yourself, and as a result, the attacker ends up getting killed or hurt, but you didn't intend them to, that's okay. That's not your fault, because all you've done is acted to preserve your life, which under the rules of natural moral law, you're totally entitled to do. So there are two outcomes there. One is that you save your own life. That's the good outcome. The other is the death or injury of your attacker, but that's an unintended bad consequence. That wasn't what you set out to do. So that's the version where it would be okay. But you would not be allowed to intend to hurt or kill your attacker. So you're not allowed to respond aggressively or with unreasonable force or do more than what is needed to do to preserve your own life. Now, if you're thinking, well, that's a bit tricky, how do you know what you're really intending? Well done, because you've just spotted quite a big problem with double effect, which we'll get into in a minute. For the purposes of the exam, it's quite useful being able to apply double effect to abortion. So let's have a look at one of these. So if a pregnant woman's life was in danger, for example, from an ectopic pregnancy. Now, an ectopic pregnancy is when the fetus starts to develop in the fallopian tube. And in that scenario, the fetus can't be saved and it's very dangerous to the mother. So if that's happening and it's putting a woman's life in danger, it would be permissible under double effect to go in and do a surgery to remove the affected fallopian tube to save her life. So you do surgery on the mother to save her life. That's the good act. The unintended consequence of this is the loss of the fetus. But what you can't do is this. You cannot go in and directly abort the fetus with the intention of saving the life of the mother, because that would be doing a bad act for a good outcome. Now, when I teach this, quite often my students say, right, this is where you've lost me, because surely having an abortion to save the mother's life is good. Not according to this, because you can't do a bad thing for a good reason under double effect. You can only do good things that have unintended bad consequences. And if you know that you are intending to perform that abortion, you are targeting the fetus in order to help the mother, that isn't allowed. So this is why people sometimes get a little bit impatient with double effects. It's got strengths and weaknesses. A strength is that in some situations it might actually be helpful. It helps people who want to follow the rules of natural moral law stay true to those rules. And it might be helpful in situations such as passive euthanasia. So if we do that one for a second, if somebody is dying and a doctor increases their pain medication to ease their suffering, but the unintended consequence is that they die a little bit sooner, you could argue that that's actually compassionate and that that's, you know, a time when it works for people rather than against people. But there's a couple of problems. Some people find it just unnecessarily complicated, and I get where they're coming from there. It's also open to misuse. So somebody could potentially pass off a bad act as simply being unintended consequences. They could maybe kill the attacker who's coming for them deliberately and say, well, I didn't mean to, I was just acting in self-defense. We see that quite a lot. A bigger problem for me is actually this: how can you truly know someone's real intentions? And this is an example out of the textbook. Is a soldier permitted to sacrifice themselves to help save others, or would they have violated natural moral law there by intending their own death? How do you know, particularly in split-second decisions, what someone's true intention is? And therefore, how do you evaluate whether they've done good or bad? That becomes very difficult. So that's double effect. At this point, I want to just revisit some of the key features of what Aquinas wanted natural moral law to be. So it was deontological because of the secondary precepts, although he wouldn't have used that word. That word came later. So there's rules for sure, but Aquinas wanted there to be some flexibility, and we can see that from what he writes about it in the Summa Theologica. And one of those things that he wrote was about the virtues. He thought the virtues were really important in helping people make the right decisions. So it isn't just a case of following the rules. You have to think, what kind of person am I being here? Now, he identified cardinal virtues and theological virtues. He's lifting a lot of this from Aristotle: justice, prudence, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and love. So where we end up is he did think it was important to follow rules. He did think it was important to fulfill obligations to each other. But it's not quite as simple as that. And it's not as simple as blindly following rules with no thought. He wouldn't have been a fan of that. But a few things happened next that maybe took us away from Aquinas's vision. So natural moral law went down very well with the Catholic Church, and after Aquinas's time, it became the standard way of doing ethics in the Catholic Church. And the Church followed Aquinas's thinking pretty closely for a bit. But then in the 16th century, so a few hundred years on, things started to change. Lots and lots of priests were being trained up. And to make this process easier, what happened was scholars would write lots of books of rules that the priest had to learn and then teach their congregations. These were known as manuals, and so these became known as the Catholic manualists. You might have come across this word casuistry, which means case law. So essentially what they were doing was they were looking at, right, what has happened before in situations? What have we done? What have we decided? Right, let's write that down as a precedent, as an example of what should happen in this situation, and that will become the rule. But the problem with that is this meant that the rules took over and natural moral law became very, very rule-based. We kind of lost sight of the virtues, and we ended up with something not that similar to Aquinas' thinking. So the intention was kind of okay. By looking up rules in the book, it was supposed to avoid any confusion, make life easier, but it took away any flexibility. It took away Aquinas's kind of wiggle room that he built in. And also, obedience to the law saved people from having to think. It meant that people could just say, well, I was just following the rules. And so these principles that were really important to Aquinas, like justice, prudence, and also faith, hope, and love, got sacrificed. Now, it's not very hard to imagine why this is bad, because, I'm sure you can think of a time where even if you respect rules, it might not be right to follow them just blindly and with no thought. So, for example, as a teacher, if I put a child in detention whose grandpa had just died because they hadn't done their homework, I could be saying, well, it's the rule. If you don't do your homework, you go into detention. But it wouldn't necessarily be the right thing to do. What happened in the end? Well, many Catholics were absolutely fine with just following the rules, but others were unhappy because they felt that it had become a bit inflexible, lacking in compassion, lacking in imagination. And so in the 20th century, a guy called Richard McCormick tried to fix this, and he came up with a version called Proportionalism. Now, here's Proportionalism. It's controversial, and the Catholic Church, I should say at the top of this, does not love this. It is not endorsed by the Catholic Church because many feel that it goes too far the other way. So it's still a form of natural moral law, still sticks with primary, secondary precepts, still claims that certain actions can never be right, but it claims that some actions may be the lesser of two evils. Still not right, but morally permissible. So let's think about the ectopic pregnancy. What you've got there essentially is two options which are both bad. So it's bad to abort the fetus, it's bad to let the mother die. Proportionalism is about letting you pick the least bad of the two bad options. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it the lesser of two evils. And so another way to put that is to say, if a proportionate reason exists to ignore a rule, then the rule can be ignored. Now you can see straight away, this helps in some ways, but you could also say, well, that's not really natural moral law anymore. That's leaning into something a little bit more similar to situation ethics, which is not going to go down well with the Catholic Church. All right, I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's helped. Take it easy, work hard, and I'll see you next time.